Your last name is hiding something. Not a scandal, not a mistake, something older, something that was spoken aloud 1,000 years ago on the deck of a longship crossing the North Sea. If your last name ends in son, you are carrying a linguistic fossil. A naming system so ancient, so distinctly Norse, that modern DNA science has begun to confirm what linguists and historians have long suspected. Those two syllables at the end of your name were not borrowed casually. They were planted deliberately, by a people who settled where they conquered and left their naming conventions behind like seeds in foreign soil. Most people assume their surname is simply a family tradition, something inherited without much thought. But language does not work that way, and neither does biology. The son suffix did not appear at random across northern England, Scotland, and Ireland. It appeared precisely where the Vikings built farms, raised children, and stayed. For generations, historians framed the Viking Age as a chapter of raids and retreats. DNA science is now telling a different story. And your name may be the first line of evidence. Before there were surnames, there were descriptions. In the Norse world, a man was known not by a fixed family name passed down through generations, but by who his father was. If your father was Erik, you were Eriksson. If your father was Bjorn, you were Bjornsson. The suffix son in Old Norse meant exactly what it sounds like, son of. It was a living label, renewed with every generation, connecting a person directly to their father's identity. This system of naming, called patronymic naming, was one of the most distinctive features of Norse culture. It traveled wherever Norse people traveled. When Viking settlers crossed the North Sea and established themselves in the river valleys of Yorkshire, the coastlines of Northumbria, and the trading ports of the Irish Sea, they brought their naming customs with them. And when those settlers had children with local women, those children were given names that followed the Norse pattern. The son suffix began to appear in English records in the 10th and 11th centuries, concentrated almost entirely in regions that had been under Scandinavian control or heavy Norse influence. A Norwegian scholar named Einar Belsheim documented this in a 1925 study of surname distribution in England and Wales. His findings were striking. The most common British surnames ending in son arose almost entirely in the Danelaw and areas of Norwegian settlement: Northumberland, Cumbria, Durham, Yorkshire, Lancashire. The map of son surnames and the map of Viking settlement were nearly identical. In 865, a force that Anglo-Saxon chroniclers called the Great Heathen Army landed in East Anglia. Unlike the raid and return pattern that defined the earlier Viking Age, this army came to conquer and to stay. Within years, it had taken Northumbria, pushed through East Anglia, and carved out control of much of northern and eastern England. By the late 9th century, a formal boundary had been drawn between the lands of the Danish Vikings and the remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex. That boundary defined a territory known as the Danelaw. The Danelaw was not simply a military occupation, it was a settlement. Norse men and women built farms. They established markets. They intermarried with local Anglo-Saxon populations. They named their towns using Old Norse words that survive today in place names like Derby, Grimsby, and Whitby, all of them carrying the Norse suffix by, meaning farm or settlement. And critically, they named their children. The son surnames that would eventually crystallize into hereditary family names, Johnson, Wilson, Thompson, Anderson, Gibson, all of them emerged in this window of dense Norse-Anglo contact in exactly the regions where Scandinavian settlers had put down roots deep enough to last. Cambridge population historians mapping surname distribution in 1881 found that son surnames were heavily concentrated in Cumberland, Northumberland, Durham, Yorkshire, and Lincolnshire, and were comparatively rare south of a line running from the Mersey to the Thames. That boundary mirrors the historical Danelaw with striking precision. Names carry memory, but DNA carries proof. Over the past 2 decades, geneticists have mapped the Norse genetic legacy across the British Isles with increasing precision, and what they have found aligns almost exactly with the distribution of son surnames. The landmark study came in September 2020, when a team led by geneticist S.K. Willerslev at the Universities of Cambridge and Copenhagen published the largest ancient genomic analysis of Viking Age populations ever conducted. Sequencing 442 genomes from archaeological sites across Scandinavia, the British Isles, Iceland, and Greenland, The team found clear evidence of distinct Norse genetic contributions flowing into different regions of Europe. Danish-associated ancestry entered England heavily, particularly in areas corresponding to the Danelaw. Norwegian-associated markers appeared in Ireland, Iceland, and Scotland. Swedish-linked profiles followed eastern trade routes toward the Baltic. Their conclusion reshaped how the Viking Age must be understood. Viking identity, the researchers confirmed, was not purely ethnic, it was cultural. People joined Norse communities, traveled under Norse banners, and raised children inside Norse, naming traditions regardless of their precise genetic origins. But the genetic signal was real and measurable, embedded in modern populations across the British Isles. Research published separately in the journal Heredity found that Shetland carries approximately 44% Scandinavian ancestry overall, and Orkney approximately 30%. These figures reflect male and female lines in nearly equal measure, confirming that Viking settlement in those islands was not a military occupation but a full demographic transplant: families, children, generations. The most direct genetic evidence of Norse ancestry runs through the Y chromosome, passed unchanged from father to son across every generation. If your paternal line carries certain markers, it becomes possible to trace that line backward through centuries, even millennia, and place it with remarkable precision in a geographic and historical context. Two haplogroups appear most consistently in Viking Age burials and in modern populations with confirmed Norse settlement history. Haplogroup I1, sometimes called the Norse haplogroup, is found today in approximately 35% of men in Norway and Sweden. It is the strongest single genetic marker associated with Scandinavian ancestry during the Viking Age. When I1 appears in high concentrations in a region outside Scandinavia, particularly one with documented Norse settlement, that clustering is meaningful. It does not appear by coincidence in Yorkshire and Orkney. It arrived with people who stayed. Haplogroup R1a, in certain Scandinavian-specific subclades, also shows clear Viking dispersal patterns. A study published in the scientific journal PLOS ONE subdivided R1 lineages and found distinct Norse Viking dispersal patterns running through northern England, consistent with Danelaw settlement rather than later migration. In Orkney, research from the People of the British Isles project found that the dominant genetic cluster carried approximately 25% Norwegian ancestry, the direct result of Norse settlement that continued for over 6 centuries. In parts of northwest England, R1 patterns showed profiles consistent with Norse rather than later medieval movement. The Y chromosome does not forget where it has been. History has a habit of telling the Viking story through male eyes. Raiders, warriors, kings. The image is so fixed that it can obscure a quieter but equally significant truth. Norse women traveled. They settled, and their DNA is also embedded in the populations of the British Isles, Ireland, and the North Atlantic. Mitochondrial DNA, which passes unchanged from mother to child regardless of sex, tells the maternal side of the story. In Iceland, genetic research revealed a pattern that could not be explained by conquest alone. Male ancestry in the early Icelandic settler population was predominantly Scandinavian. Female ancestry was predominantly Celtic, drawn from the populations of Ireland and the British Isles. This combination suggests deliberate settlement rather than raiding. Norsemen traveled to Britain and Ireland, formed relationships with local women, and brought those women and their families to new colonies in the North Atlantic. In Greenland, DNA recovered from Viking Age burials showed a similar mixture. Scandinavian men from what is now Norway paired with women from the British Isles, building communities at the edge of the known world. This matters for anyone researching son surnames. If your paternal line carries a Norse Y chromosome marker, and your maternal line shows Celtic or British Isles ancestry, that combination is not random. It is a pattern that geneticists have now documented repeatedly across Viking settlement zones. You may be looking at the direct genetic signature of a Norse man and a local woman who built a family together in the 10th century and whose descendants never left. Not every son surname carries equal weight as a Norse indicator. Some arrived through Germanic naming traditions that predate the Vikings entirely. Some came later, through Norman influence after 1066. The research distinguishes between them not perfectly, but meaningfully, by tracing where they first appear in historical records and in what concentrations. Johnson, the second most common surname in the United States today, traces to son of John, a name that spread widely through both Norse and later Christian traditions. Its concentration in Danelaw counties in early English records, however, places its English emergence squarely in zones of heavy Norse contact. Wilson, meaning son of Will, derives from a given name with Old Norse linguistic roots. Its earliest documented English appearance dates to the 14th century in northern England. Thompson, meaning son of Thomas, carries both Norse structural form and a geographic distribution in early records that aligns closely with Danelaw settlement zones. Anderson, son of Andrew, appears in Scandinavian forms as Anderson and Anderson, and was brought by Norse immigrants into both Scotland and England, where it merged with locally formed versions of the same name. What unites these surnames is not simply their suffix, it is where they crystallized as hereditary names. Between the 10th and 12th centuries, in precisely the regions where Norse settlers had spent 2 centuries intermarrying and integrating, son names became fixed. The naming custom did not spread evenly across England. It spread along the contours of Norse settlement, and the surnames it produced have never moved far from where they first appeared. Before I show you the last part, if you want to look at your own results and see where Viking ancestry fits into your bloodline, I put a full 3-volume PDF bundle over at the OriginDNA website. It shows you how to read your raw data and find matches beyond what Ancestry or 2, 3, and Me tell you. Link is in the description. But stay right here, because what comes next is the part most people completely miss. There is a second layer of evidence that sits beneath the surname, one that most people drive past without recognizing. It is written into the landscape itself. The villages, towns, and geographic features that surround the places where son surnames first appeared carry their own Norse signatures, and those signatures confirm that the naming pattern was not accidental. Old Norse place name elements are concentrated in precisely the same counties where son surnames emerged. The suffix by, meaning farm or settlement, appears in Whitby, Grimsby, Derby, Selby, and hundreds of smaller villages across Yorkshire and Lincolnshire. The suffix thorp, meaning secondary settlement or outlying farm, appears in dozens of Danelaw communities. The suffix thwaite, from the Norse word for clearing, marks landscapes that Norse farmers shaped. When your ancestral records trace back to a village ending in by or thorp or thwaite, that is not a coincidence set against a son surname. It is corroboration. Norse settlers named the land the same way they named their children. Both systems left behind a map. Research into the Danelaw's linguistic legacy found that there are more words of Norwegian and Danish origin embedded in the regional English dialects of former Danelaw counties than anywhere else in England. Words like bairn for child and flit for moving house survive in northern dialects today as direct descendants of Old Norse speech. The language did not disappear. It went underground, surfacing in place names, dialect words, and the surnames that millions of people still carry without knowing what they once announced. If son surnames are this clearly tied to Norse settlement, and if the DNA evidence is this consistent, why did it take so long for the connection to be recognized? Why were most people never told? Part of the answer lies in how national histories are constructed. As England, Scotland, and Ireland developed stronger political identities through the medieval and early modern periods, the story of Viking influence became inconvenient. England needed a clean Anglo-Saxon origin story. Scotland needed its Celtic roots. Ireland needed Gaelic continuity. Viking ancestry complicated all of those narratives. The monks who wrote the earliest chronicles of the Viking Age experienced those raids firsthand. Their accounts emphasized fire and destruction, not the quieter decades that followed, when Norse settlers paid taxes, attended local markets, married local women, and sent their children to grow up speaking a blend of Old Norse and Old English that historians now call Anglo-Scandinavian. There was also a deliberate reshaping of the Viking image in the 19th century. Scandinavian nations claimed the Vikings as heroic national ancestors. Other nations kept them at arm's length. Fascinating but foreign, a temporary interruption rather than a founding presence. That framing persisted in school books for generations. And so the son's surnames sat in plain sight, generations of families carrying them without understanding what they encoded. Not simply a family tradition, a cultural fossil, the last visible remnant of a Norse father who settled in a Danelaw village 12 centuries ago and had a child whose descendants, remarkably, are still here. If you have taken an autosomal DNA test with a company like Ancestry DNA or 23andMe, you may already be holding the evidence without knowing how to read it. A result showing Scandinavian, Norwegian, Swedish, or Danish ancestry does not necessarily mean you have a grandparent who immigrated from those countries. For many people with British, Irish, or Scottish family roots, it reflects something far older. Viking settlement in the Danelaw and beyond happened between roughly 800 and 1066 CE. 1,000 years of subsequent generations have diluted that Scandinavian signal considerably, but not eliminated it. A result of 5, 10, or even 15% Scandinavian ancestry in someone with entirely English or Irish family trees is consistent with descent from Norse settlers, not from recent immigrants. The people of the British Isles genetic study found Scandinavian admixture levels reaching 38% in the Wirral Peninsula and West Lancashire, 37% in Penrith in Cumbria, and 39% on the Isle of Man, all regions with documented Norse settlement. These figures track the male line specifically. The autosomal signal across all chromosomes is typically lower, but measurable. If your DNA results show any Scandinavian signal, and your family roots are in the old Danelaw counties or the Norse settlement zones of Scotland and Ireland, that signal is not noise. It is a message that has been traveling forward through time for 1,000 years. Your son's surname may have announced it long before any DNA kit confirmed it. There is something worth sitting with here. Millions of people across the English-speaking world carry son surnames without any awareness of what those two syllables once meant. Johnson, Wilson, Anderson, Thompson, Gibson, Williamson, Robertson. Each of them, in their original Norse form, was a sentence. Son of John, son of Will, son of Anders, son of Thomas, son of Gilbert, son of William, son of Robert. They were identities announced aloud, at markets and in legal records, and at church. They told people who your father was, and through him, what family you came from, what settlement you belonged to. When those patronymics eventually froze into hereditary surnames, somewhere between the 10th and 12th centuries in the old Danelaw territories, the chain from father to child stopped updating at every generation. But the name remained. The 2020 Nature study found that approximately 6% of people in the United Kingdom carried detectable Viking-era ancestry. In Sweden, the figure reaches approximately 10%. Those percentages do not capture the full depth of the Norse genetic contribution, which in certain Northern English and Scottish populations runs far higher. What they confirm is that the Viking Age did not end. It was absorbed. It became local. It became English and Scottish and Irish in language and identity, while remaining in its DNA and its surnames unmistakably Norse. Your name has known this for 1,000 years. Modern science has finally caught up. The Viking story was never just about raids. It was about roots, about people who crossed dangerous water, settled in unfamiliar land, built families, and left their mark in ways that could not be erased by the passage of time or the revision of history books. If your last name ends in son, you are holding one of those marks. It is older than your country, older than the modern nations that surround it, older than almost any institution you can name. It was placed there by a naming system that Norse settlers carried across the North Sea and planted in the soil of Britain and Ireland, where it grew into something that became local, became English, became yours. DNA science has now confirmed what the surnames were always suggesting. The evidence is in the Y chromosome haplogroups clustering in old Danelaw counties. It is in the Scandinavian admixture percentages that keep appearing in people with entirely British family trees. It is in the place names that surround the villages where those son names first crystallized. It has always been there, hidden in the two syllables at the end of your name, waiting for someone to look closely enough to recognize what they were reading. If this opened a door you did not know was there, subscribe to the channel and like the video. There is more history hiding inside science than most people ever get told.
Thanks for watching. Before you head out, don't let your DNA profile just sit there collecting digital dust. Tap the link in the description to download your ebook and finally make sense of it all tonight.